Hello, BookTube. Well, it was only a matter of time, wasn't it? It was only a matter of time until infighting broke out in the ranks of ShakeTube 2018. Until it was only a matter of time until civil blood made civil hands unclean. And I know what you're thinking. You're thinking if such civil strife broke out, it would certainly happen between me and, for instance, Jason at Old Blues Chapter and Verse, because despite the fact that he likes to affect being a kindly guy who gives little chats while he's knitting, you get the sense when you watch him that he appreciates a good scrap now and then. Or maybe even that it would be Lukash, who had the nerve to attend Iowa State University, the hated rivals of my beloved Iowa Hawkeyes. But no, no, it's always the quiet ones, isn't it? No. A horrific civil war has broken out between me and Mark at Words Everywhere. Soft-spoken, gentle, introspective Mark at Words Everywhere just made a video titled Subjectivity in Art Appreciation. And he doesn't name any names. He's too nice for that. And I am hoping that there were other booktubers who also excited his ire in addition to me. But one way or another, what followed in a soft-spoken rant video while he sipped Jim Beam-infused coffee was all about a subject that has vexed BookTube for a long time, probably since its inception, since it's infected book discussion forever. And that is the very thing that he talks about in his title, Subjectivity in Art Appreciation. I knew when I read that title something of what was coming, because, to put it mildly, I have encountered this before in my life. And every time somebody goes on a rambling rant about subjectivity and art appreciation, my first reaction is to say, why don't you pick on somebody else's profession? But no, it's a serious subject and it's worth talking about. And unfortunately, although Mark has no greater fan on BookTube than I do, in fact, his channel is a perfect example of my number one complaint about BookTube, because you listen to his content, analyzing Shakespeare's sonnets, talking about poetry, reading poetry with a real fine ear, and if you just listen to his content, you automatically assume that he has a couple of thousand subscribers, and he doesn't. And that weird disconnect between the seriousness of presentation and the number of people who respond is why I think visible or knowable subscriber counts is such an iniquitous thing for BookTube just in general. Because you look at that and you think, okay, what's wrong here? There isn't anything wrong here except for this video. So I want to go through some of the points that he makes. He doesn't, as is true, I'm not picking on him. This is true for everybody who talks about this subject. He doesn't make his points in the way of calculating things on an abacus. Instead, he rather wanders around like an 8-ball on a pool table. So he starts off by alluding to the Man Booker Prize. Specifically this year's Man Booker long list, which included a comic book. Apparently elsewhere, other in his non-Steve life on YouTube and BookTube, he's been getting flack for defending the Man Booker's choice, or rather not so much their choice as the validity of the art form of the graphic novel. At one point in his video, he says, we cannot say that opera is objectively better than rap, and we cannot say that literary fiction is objectively better than a graphic novel. To which I would agree. I had to wade through his video to get to something that I agreed with. That happens at the end. But I do actually agree with that. The only problem is that's not what we're talking about. The people who came forward in the wake of the Man Booker Prize decision to include a comic book, who said comic books are not a worthy form of art, or they're less worthy than literary fiction, the people, like this person who came forward and said to Mark himself that opera is a better kind of music than rap, are simply wrong, and maybe not just simply wrong, maybe they're also snobs. But that's not the point of the Man Booker long list including a comic book. The point is that it's not the same thing. And that is so easily conflated that people do it all the time. They say, someone who says that a graphic novel is not as good a form of art as a literary novel is wrong. Somebody who says that a graphic novel is not the same kind of a thing as a literary novel is right. So when Mark says in this video a graphic novel is a book just as a novel is a book, he is objectively wrong. Right? A graphic novel is at least half illustration. You and I have both read graphic novels that had no words in them at all. Obviously, if something doesn't rely on words exclusively or mostly, then it's not the same kind of thing as the thing that does. That if you start to say, and now a lot of the people connected with the Man Booker made that line of argument. They said that a graphic novel is a book just like a novel is a book, showing astonishing stupidity about what they're judging. But given the judges for this year's Man Booker, I wasn't really surprised at that. If you ignore the objective categories, the descriptions, the actual objective descriptions of separate forms of art, then you could say that anything is qualified for the Man Booker. And you'd be wrong to do that. The Man Booker is about literature. It's about writing. It's about prose. It's not about prose that depends or works in concert with pictures. So I think the objection, does a comic book belong on the Man Booker list, is fairly trivially dismissed. As far as I'm concerned, it's not a major debate. It doesn't. It was done for shock value. It was done to show the world that the Man Booker is woke, that the Man Booker is hashtag sensitive, that the Man Booker is not hidebound by weird things like experience or tradition. No, it's the larger point in this video that got me, that stuck in my craw. Because Mark starts out by saying, you can see right away how the conflation happens, how this thing wanders in the way that this discussion always does. And I want to try to clarify things so that maybe it won't do that in the future. The title of the video is Subjectivity and Art Appreciation. And one of the first things that he says is appreciation of art is subjective. This is entirely true. Obviously, this is entirely true. If it weren't, then there wouldn't be any modern art museums that have blank canvases or square wooden blocks painted red and then put on a pedestal and sold to the museum for $750,000. If appreciation of art weren't subjective, no one would ever get away with such outright highway robbery, such outright fraud. But inevitably, when somebody starts by saying interpretation of art is entirely subjective, they then wander. Because how you interpret something is up to you, right? I mean, as we see in spoken conversation all the time, someone can say, don't do that, and one person will interpret it as a comforting warning not to make a mistake, another person will interpret it as an abrasive command. So, of course, that's subjective. But that's never where this discussion stops, and it doesn't stop in Mark's video, which I will link down below. I'm hoping that we can do something about that subscriber count. As long as we're stuck with them, we should all be subscribing to each other. But anyway, he moves on. He starts out by saying appreciation of art is subjective. And then not a minute later, he says art is entirely subjective. And that's when you know that you are slowly paddling into troubled waters. Art is entirely subjective is a sentence so vague that it doesn't actually mean anything. But when somebody says something like art is entirely subjective, I know what's coming. And sure enough, I didn't have to wait long before I got there. Right after art is entirely subjective, he says an individual's interpretation of art, of an artwork, is entirely up to that individual. Okay, we seem to be back in safe territory. That is true. Of course, no one's dictating your interpretation of anything. But then we get the whammy. The whammy always comes. Right after that, the criteria that we use to judge art is entirely subjective. Notice we've gone from appreciating to the criteria that we use to judge art. And that is totally wrong. That is factually totally wrong. The criteria that we use to judge art is not entirely subjective. Obviously, right? I don't suppose there's anyone listening to me who won't think there's an art involved in architecture. Maybe not routine house building, but building a monument, a memorial of some kind. Of course, there's art involved in that, which is why there's usually a contest of some kind where people submit their designs to a judging committee. There's art involved in that. Not just aesthetic art, but architectural art. The criteria that we use to judge that is not entirely subjective, right? Because if somebody submits a plan for a World War I memorial that consists of a mixtape, it will be rejected on entirely objective criteria. And that's an extreme example, but the examples don't have to be extreme to hold the course. A statement that the criteria that we use to judge something is entirely subjective is totally wrong, and it feeds into it comes from the idea that artistic endeavors are somehow an entirely different category than any other kind of human endeavor, which is totally wrong. I reject that completely. I think you might think, okay, if you think that way, you're following in the footsteps of Aristotle and the Greeks and whatnot. You're putting art on the slopes of Mount Helicon. You're saying that it's a different, fundamentally different kind of human endeavor than anything else. I think when you do that, you are fundamentally misserving artists themselves. Art is a human endeavor, okay? All things that humans do are human endeavors, okay? There's no divine element of this at all. There's no divinity here at all. There's nothing intangible or supernatural involved in any of this. Art is a human endeavor. All human endeavors are bounded by criteria. All human endeavors are bounded by things that make it that endeavor as opposed to some other endeavor. So art is no different than bricklaying, pipe laying, touchdown throwing at the Super Bowl. Art is a human endeavor. All human endeavors can be judged. All human endeavors have criteria by which they can be judged. If you don't say that, then what have you made art? This kind of loosey-goosey, gaseous formation that can be anything to anybody, and you can see the temptation. Mark often veers towards viewing it that way in this one video. But that's not true. Art is not separate, and of course we use objective criteria to judge all other kinds of human endeavor. You don't say to your heart surgeon, well, I'm not going to judge you by your results because they're entirely subjective. You don't do that. And you shouldn't do it with a poem or a literary contest or an opera. Anyway, so he starts off, he gets to the point where he's saying the criteria that we use to judge art is entirely subjective. And then he shortens that by saying the way we judge art is entirely subjective. I have been facing this in one form or another for my entire professional career, where I tell somebody, or usually they learn, or they object because of a conclusion that I've come to, and they say, oh, you're a critic. Oh, well, it's all subjective. Anyway, how many times have you seen BookTube videos where people say, slightly defensively, well, you know, this critic didn't like it, but all criticism is subjective anyway. I've lost count of how many Lyft riders or kids at parties or whatever have come out with a variation of that line of, well, you didn't like it, but it's all subjective anyway, right? No, it isn't. Appreciation, reaction is entirely subjective. What you personally feel about a piece of art, any piece of art, is entirely subjective. It's entirely a thing of how it strikes you. But judging it on criteria is not entirely subjective at all. If you say that it is, you reduce all of this art that you want to elevate to nonsense. And you say, among many other things, that skill is irrelevant. Because if you say that judging art is entirely subjective, what was it? The way we judge art is entirely subjective. If you say that, then you remove skill. You remove accomplishment from the equation. Because you're saying it's all subjective, completely subjective, meaning that a fifth grader who writes a poem in crayon and Alfred Lord Tennyson, the way you will judge the outcome of both of those endeavors is entirely subjective. And you might think that's an easy, I'm making it cartoonishly exaggerated. Okay, what if we don't say that then? What if we don't say that? What if we say the best-selling Victorian poet and Alfred Lord Tennyson, both of them take a month to write a poem? The results will be judgeable, objectively speaking. Your reaction to them, your appreciation of them is entirely subjective and entirely up to you. There are Victorian poets that are totally forgotten today, who I think did wonderful work. Same thing with the 20th century. Same thing with the 21st century. Only in the 21st century, all that I'm talking about here suddenly becomes weaponized. In the 20th century, when I had this debate, the end result was either people agreeing to disagree or young people saying to me, okay, I see what you're saying. So I get to have my own personal reactions to things, but I don't get to look at something and say, okay, it has 10 words, they're very simple words, and they're arranged in very simple ways. But I say that's just as good as this Spenserian sonnet, even though the criteria I'm using to judge them both is literary variety and complexity, grounds on which the first poem obviously isn't as good as the second poem. I'm going to say those are my grounds. Those are what I mean, because that's the product of skill in the very objective genre that we're talking about. I'm going to say that's what I mean, but the results are meaningless. When you do that, you are undercutting the very foundation of literary endeavor, which is that you try it and try it and try it, getting better and better and learning from your mistakes and the successes of others until you are much better at it than an ordinary person. That's the only reason that we read these things, is because the people who have worked and striven to get better, to match their craft to maybe the genius they had when they started, have succeeded, where other people who have tried have failed. In the 21st century, that's grounds for a lawsuit, but that's nevertheless still reality. Years ago, I knew young people who were all poetasters. They were all, I'm high as a kite at some gin party, and I feel like writing a sonnet, and I don't know what a sonnet is. I'm just going to write a stack of lines, and then the next morning I'm going to see it, and the objective part of my brain is going to say, okay, well, I was clearly drunk, and this is worthless. But the new part of my brain, the part of my brain for the 21st century, is going to say, no, yes, it's worthless, but I also think it's genius. And I knew a group of people who would say that about each other. They would say, well, I don't need to know John Milton because I am an expert in Bob Jones, my buddy. I don't need to know the rest of it. And you can see that happening in the transformation of the literary canon, where all of a sudden now in schools it's entirely possible to do without the canon. If you're a freshman undergraduate at a college in America, who knows what you'll be exposed to? But the sacredness of teachers' responsibility for showing students the canon and then letting them make what they will of it is largely gone. It's eroded to the point where freshman syllabuses are sometimes unrecognizable. Anyway. Perhaps sensing that he was wandering into trouble, Marx says there is no better art form than any other. He sort of moves back onto semi-safe territory, because that's absolutely true. There is no better art form than any other. But then he says an artistic opinion is an emotional reaction. Okay, maybe your reaction, the title of this video, your appreciation of a work of art is an emotional reaction. Hopefully it's more than that, right? Hopefully there are elements of thought, experience, evaluation involved. But okay, fine, it's an emotional reaction. But saying that it's the be-all and end-all of how you approach a work of art, let's say a work of literature, again, fatally undercuts what literature actually is. The only reason that, in this same video, at the beginning of this video, he talks about how later in the week he will be delving into Shakespeare's sonnets. He lists some of the sonnets he's going to talk about and mentions they're not easy, but we're going to be going in them at depth. Well, why aren't they easy? It's not just because Shakespeare wrote 500 years ago. That's especially not true in the sonnets. Why aren't they easy? Because they're brilliant. That's why. Do you seriously think that in 2 seconds I couldn't show you a sonnet from the exact same time that Shakespeare was writing his own that isn't difficult? I could. Easily. I could. Easily. I could also write one myself that wouldn't be difficult for you to delve to the very bottom of. The reason that there's a difference is because there's expertise, there's genius, there's work. And you can't undercut work. And when you say something that on the surface sounds as approachably egalitarian as, what was it again? the way we judge art is entirely subjective. That sounds wonderful. It sounds like it gives everybody a seat at the table. But when you say that, you are saying all art is neither good nor bad. But thinking makes it so. And that isn't true. That objectively isn't true. If you get some MFA graduate who has one precious collection of short stories to his credit and has now embarked on his debut novel, and you read that novel and the characters are obviously, mimeographs of people from his life. They aren't rounded in the way that fiction characters should be. The action is stop-start and then eventually just peters out. There is no plot line. There is no satisfying arc of any kind. You leave it wondering what it is you read. And the reason for that, in addition to the arrogance of the 21st century that has been fostered by MFA programs, is simple beginner's incompetence. That's all. In a way that you take the same material, same characters, same everything, same setting, and hand it to an experienced novelist, including that novelist 20 years from now, and you will get an entirely better book, an entirely more satisfying, more competent book. Proficient, sometimes even brilliant book. That is not subjective. that is not just a matter of opinion. You might like the earlier book better, but if you line them up side by side, I can point out to you, chapter and verse, right down the line, the superiorities of the second to the first, the later book to the earlier book. And they won't be my opinions. I can point out, okay, what about this character? She shows up, she's talked about at length for 30 pages and then never appears again. That's inept. In a novel, that's inept. Or we're led to believe that this character is going to be extremely important to the plot. Then the author obviously loses interest and doesn't control himself enough to rework the novel once that's done. But anyway, when you're at the point where you're saying the way we judge art is entirely subjective, if you're at that point in a video, you know that you are teetering on the edge of saying absolute nonsense. And I was hoping, even with my gumption up, I was hoping that Mark would not teeter into absolute nonsense in this video. And my hopes were dashed. Because he does. Almost inevitably, when you get somebody talking like this about how all art is subjective, how there are no rules here at all, how, if you have the Man Booker long list for contemporary fiction, and I want to submit, or some publisher wants to submit a copy of the 1987 UK tax code, well, they can. And if you say they can't, you're some sort of horrible snob. Maybe you deserve a hashtag. Maybe two. Once you get to the point where you're saying stuff like that, absolute bald nonsense will never be far behind. When it comes to that, I always have to hope the person will simply stop before they get to it. Mark did not. Perhaps because of the extra Irish in his coffee. But either way, there are two lines at the end of the video that struck me. The first one is, reality cannot inform our opinion when it comes to art. Which is the ultimate exponent of this thing that's been a bugaboo for me my whole life, where people take creative art, poetry, songwriting, librettos, novels, whatever, and move it away up into the clouds with the gods. They move it away completely. Somehow it has become transcendent, and we can't talk about it as a nuts and bolts kind of thing. On one level, maybe I understand that, because its effects on us are transcendent in a way that, for instance, cars tend not to be, although I know some people. Its subjective effects on us can be transcendent, and so it's maybe obvious that we look at that and we think, okay, well, the thing that did this has to be transcendent itself, but that's not true. The transcendent effects on us are the effects of skill at specific things that can be done less well, which is why we don't talk about 90% of the authors who ever wrote in the history of the world. The reason we don't talk about them is because they did it less well than the ones we do talk about. And if you say that difference doesn't make a distinction anymore, then you wipe out talent. You wipe out accomplishment. It's the wrong compensation for a hashtaggy feeling that the whole subgroups of people have somehow been excluded from the table of literature. I've never really understood that. In society, in politics, yes, absolutely. In literature, I've never really understood this whole representation business. Women have been dominating the written word for 400 years, and when when it's not women, literature has been a broader field than many, many other forms of human endeavor. I don't think it has as much to atone for in this suddenly puritanical court of public opinion as many other kinds of human endeavor. Like, for instance, the architecture contests that I was mentioning. If there were, in 1920, if there were a contest for a big memorial fountain outside of Grand Central Station, and the people who were submitting plans for it had to submit them in person, and a black architect had shown up in 1920, he would not have got the job. And that needs atoning. I again point out in this video, as hopelessly everywhere else in all other fora, that atoning is a social thing and not an artistic thing. Society has to fix that, and then art will reflect it. But one way or another, when you get to the point where you're saying reality cannot inform our opinion when it comes to art, you know you're in trouble. And the follow-up line was, we cannot come to a consensus as to what an objective fact is. And then Mark goes on with a priori mathematical realities, 2 and 2 make 4, that sort of thing. And you just stare. When this has always happened to me at undergraduate beer keggers or back porches or whatever, I just end up staring. Reality, we cannot come to a consensus as to what an objective fact is. Reality cannot inform your opinion when it comes to art. No. No. If you have a contest like the Man Booker, and somebody submits for consideration a graphic novel in which 50%, 2/3 of the narrative job of the book in question is being handled by something that isn't words, then factually, objectively, that thing is less literary than the things that are relying only on words. It is obviously less literary. It is also obviously a different category of things. How do you know that one of the novels, the plain old boring novels that's on the long list, how do you know that novelist doesn't know an award-winning artist? And that maybe if it was really important to that novelist to get on the Man Booker long list, maybe they'd have said, well, maybe this should be illustrated. But no, they submitted their books because the Man Booker has demarcated the objective standards by which its books will be judged. A graphic novel doesn't meet those standards. It's a different thing. And that's reality. And we can rely on reality to make decisions about art. In fact, we can't rely on anything else. The video that Mark makes has a central point to it. I think a salvageable central point. It isn't all about, the title says subjectivity and art appreciation, but it isn't all about that. The thing that's clearly on his mind is one of the last things that he says in the video. We cannot say opera is objectively better than rap, and we cannot say literary fiction is objectively better than a graphic novel. And that's true, but only because of the fuzziness of the word better. We can say that opera is a far, far more complex thing than rap. But I would like to think, even in the 21st century of Scoldier than thou, that would be beyond argument. Opera, a grand opera is obviously a more complex form of art than a rap song. And a graphic novel is obviously a completely different kind of art form from a literary novel. A literary novel doesn't have pictures. I'd like to think these things were absolutely self-evidently objective, but apparently not. So what I wanted to stick up for my own profession, which is the profession of judging things, not appreciating them. In my reviews, I never tell a reader how they should or should not react to a book. Sometimes I'm appalled by their reactions. Sometimes I learn from their reactions. Instead, what I tell them is how they should judge a book, how I judged it. And that is not subjective. If I tell you in a review, this is the yawning hole on BookTube that's been left when Jennifer, an insert literary pun here, left. If I tell you in a review that an author has a very affecting voice, this feels like this book will get in amongst your emotions, but that the main problem that the author lays out for her main character is totally unsatisfactory and is unresolved at the end of the book, and that will leave a bad taste in your mouth, you can bet your last Boston cream pie that when you get around to reading the book, that's the reaction you'll have. Because I'm not injecting anything subjective. I'm saying in the written words on the page, there is no way to construe this as a success. So, on the one hand, when this subject comes up, I always want to defend my profession, which is the profession of judging things, of judging this particular field of human endeavor. But I also wanted to bring it up because it plagues BookTube. This fuzziness in thinking. Notice in this video itself, we go from appreciation to interpretation to judging in one video. And it doesn't look, watching the video, it didn't look to me like Mark was really aware that he was talking about different things. Fundamentally different things. And that wouldn't surprise me, because this conflation has been going on for so long that most people think of it as the same thing. So I thought I would make my 2 cents worth in response to his video. And here's hoping that some sort of healing can be done in the ranks of ShakeTube 2018, because we don't want all of us fighting all of it. Oh, maybe the rest of you do. Maybe the rest of you would like the spectacle of all of us just going to town on each other. But anyway, it's worth thinking about, and it is very much worth watching the original video at Words Everywhere. I'll leave a link down below, and you should all go and watch it and see what you think. But be prepared for stiff resistance on my part if you come away from this little debate saying, no, I don't think there are any criteria. I think this four-word lullaby is brilliant. Just in terms of a song, I'm going to rank it with the best songs from the German leader, and there's nothing you can say about it because it's all objective, right, man? Be prepared for stiff resistance on Steve's part if you try something like that. But anyway, I'm going to wrap this up for now, but I've got a lot of other things to talk about, so I will see you soon. Thank you, BookTube.